I'll just go through the boring housekeeping stuff first, which is that these are the fire escapes, and that if you hear a fire alarm, it's a real thing, so you should use them. And just turn off your phones, please. Just waiting for the last entries and the doors to close. Okay, so good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. My name is Salma Dabbar, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the International Center of Justice for Palestinians, which is a new organization founded just over a year ago. Some of you were here in May for our first event on responding to apartheid. We were founded by my directors, both of whom are here today, Tayeb Ali and Crispin Blunt, MP, with his hand up. We're an independent, international, and interdisciplinary organization, and we work in the field of law, politics, arts, and media outreach. To date, most of our work has been legal. Our most recent submission to the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court at The Hague was on September the 23rd, so just a couple of weeks ago, and it was with regards to the shooting of 2 journalists in Jenin on the 11th of May 2020, when we submitted a communication regarding the killing of Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, the non-fatal wounding of journalist and producer Ali Samoudi and their colleague Shava Hanaisha. This communication followed our earlier submission in April on the systematic targeting of Palestinian journalists by Israeli forces, according to the International Federation of Journalists. We're very happy to have Jim Bumella with us here tonight, and the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, with whom we're working on this case, as well as with Doughty Street Chambers and bindman solicitors. Since the year 2000, more than 45 Palestinian journalists have been killed by Israeli forces. We are an organization who believe that people who shoot clearly marked journalists should not be entitled to any kind of impunity, which is the reason for our representations being taken to the Office of the Prosecutor. As an organization, we believe that if the law is good enough for Palestinians, it's good enough for anyone, and we believe that the right to boycott is one of the many rights to protect the fundamental liberties in this country. We're very pleased that so many of you have been able to join us today. It was quite difficult for us to work out how many of you would turn out, because we had people like Golda Meir and Theodore Herzl block booking some of our tickets on Eventbrite, even though they've been dead for many decades. And we got some very interesting and colourful communications on our ICJP page about us as an organization, my favorite of which was the one which called us uncircumcised Philistines. So we don't believe that we are any of those things, and I think that in terms of describing ourselves as people, as individuals that you'll meet here tonight, the expression that I really liked that stayed in my mind was one that Rajesh Surani used when talking about people who fight for justice, for human rights, for accountability, for political change. And he used the term romantic revolutionaries. So I kind of like to think that we're a band of romantic revolutionaries gathered in this room today. And it's a real pleasure for me to hand over to Gillian Slovo, who many of you will already be familiar with. She's chairing this event at the end of the panel. She was the 25th president of English Pen. She's a South African playwright, novelist, and memoirist. And she's taken part in overseas delegations to protest the killing of journalists in Mexico. Her memoir, Every Secret Thing, My Family, My Country, is an account of her childhood in South Africa and her relationship with her parents, Joe Slovo and Ruth First, who are both major figures in the South African anti-apartheid movement. I'll leave it to Gillian to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Salma. what I'm going to do is introduce the panel, the distinguished panel here, and then ask them questions and hope to have a conversation between us and a conversation with you. So I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they be speaking, which is we start with Omar Barghouti. Can you put your hand up, or maybe everybody can see. He's a Palestinian human rights defender and co-founder of BDS, the Boycott, Disinvestment and Sanctions Movement. He's the author of BDS, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights, and of many comment pieces for US and UK newspapers, and he is a co-recipient of the 2017 Gandhi Peace Prize. And he also happens to hold a bachelor and master's degree in electrical engineering and is currently working on a PhD in philosophy at the University of Amsterdam, as you do. The second person is Ahmad Abouful, who is a Palestinian Dutch international lawyer, legal research and advocacy officer at Al-Haq, which is an independent Palestinian non-governmental human rights organization based in the West Bank. He's also a visiting research fellow at the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, which is in Rotterdam. The third person is Ben Jamal, who is the director of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, a UK-based organization working for peace, equality and justice and against racism, occupation and colonization. They're the largest organization in the UK dedicated to securing Palestinian human rights and are at the forefront of efforts to support the boycott movement across the UK. And our fourth person is Manveer Bullar, who is a head of legal at the International Center of Justice for Palestinians, our host, and a qualified solicitor specializing in civil liberties. She's represented prisoners, bereaved families at inquests, victims of modern slavery and torture in immigration detention, and victims of gender-based violence. She also has experience in providing training and advice to NGOs, campaign groups, and charities. And our fifth is Christabel Gurney, a member of the Advisory Council of ACTSA, which is the Action for Southern Africa, and was secretary of the Anti-Apartheid Movement Archives Committee. She is a former anti-apartheid movement activist campaigning for consumer boycott and sanctions against apartheid in South Africa. And finally, we have Sarah Lee Whitson, who is an American US attorney and the executive director of DAWN, which stands for Democracy for the Arab World Now. She has led dozens of advocacy and investigative missions throughout the region and has published widely on human rights and foreign policy. She's also a member of the advisory board of the ICJP. So that's our panel, and I'm going to begin at the beginning with Omar, which is why BDS? Why did you decide to start it?
Thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be with you, although things in Palestine are not source of pleasure at this point, but we're resisting this system, and that's the key point. BDS was born in 2005 by the absolute majority in Palestinian society, inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, the US civil rights movement, but mainly rooted in a very long heritage of Palestinian nonviolent popular resistance. Because of the system of oppression, settler colonialism, apartheid, military occupation, Palestinians learned that our intifadas, our uprisings, our resistance within Palestine is insufficient without cutting the links of complicity, international complicity, in the system of oppression. It is impossible for Palestinians alone, even if supported by the majority in the Arab world, to do it, to liberate ourselves without cutting the links of complicity. Because Israel's system of oppression is supported by corporations, by states, by institutions worldwide, including especially in this country and the US. So without addressing that, it's impossible to achieve liberation. The work that we do, boycotts, divestments, and eventually sanctions, and sanctions, we have to qualify that because we believe in targeted sanctions. We don't believe in illegal sanctions like the ones imposed by the US by half a dozen or a dozen global South countries. Boycotts and divestment mainly focus on academic, cultural, sports, military embargoes, corporations that are involved in maintaining the occupation, the settlements, the apartheid system, and so on. But it's very important to talk a bit about the principles, because you said why BDS and how we're doing it. It's not just about the tactics, it has key principles. The philosophical foundations of the boycott movement is that we believe in anti-racism, against discrimination in all ways. So anti-black racism, anti-Jewish racism, anti-Muslim racism, anti-Arab, discrimination against women, against queers, we oppose all forms of discrimination and racism, and that's a key pillar. It's not a tactic, it's a key pillar for our movement, and that allows us also to work intersectionally across the world with other justice movements. So the BDS movement is very well connected in very organic coalitions with the climate justice movement, the racial justice movement, Black Lives Matter in the US, women's movements, and so on and so forth across the world. Indigenous peoples' movements, of course, in North America, South America, Australia, and so on. The most important point is that BDS targets complicity, not identity. That's a very important principle. In other words, although we were inspired a lot by the South African experience, and we were discussing this before we came here, the one thing we did not copy from South Africa, let's say, and it's never copy-paste, but let me use that term, is the cultural and academic boycott in South Africa, which was across the board against everyone and everything South African. The Palestinian boycott is very targeted. It targets institutions, not individuals, because we do not target identity. We couldn't care less whether JCB is Israeli, British, Chinese, American, or French. JCB is involved in Israeli crimes against Palestinians. We will boycott, call for divestments from JCB. We target companies, we could target institutions, it's based on complicity, not identity. The second most important thing to remember, if you forget everything I said, just remember complicity, not identity. And the other point, again about complicity, it's your state's complicity, your institutions' complicity that we're talking about. We're not asking people in this country for charity. We're asking for meaningful solidarity, which starts with ending complicity. Almost every higher education institution in this country has some form of complicity with Israeli academic institutions, all of which are part of the apartheid settler colonial system. Your government, need I speak about the details? I mean, everyone, I don't need to say anything. It's not just Balfour, it's getting worse than Balfour now. So, I mean, your government is one of the most criminal in supporting this criminal system against us. And now they want to move the embassy to occupy Jerusalem. Anyway, let's skip that. But your corporations, so as people living in a more or less democratic, underline less in the current circumstances, quasi-democratic country like yours, you still have some democratic freedoms and rights where you can pressure your institutions to end their complicity. That's what we're asking for, first and foremost, end complicity. In a nutshell, that's what BDS is for.
Thank you. You said it's founded and supported by the absolute majority of Palestinians. How would you know?
Because every major entity in Palestinian society, the coalition of political parties, all trade unions, women's unions, teachers' unions, doctors, lawyers, every main entity in Palestinian society in historic Palestine as well as in exile is part of the BDS leadership, which is the Boycott National Committee. So it's just about every major entity in Palestinian society.
And how do you answer the charge that boycotts hurt not only the Israeli state, but also people in Israel who want to change things between Israel and Palestinians?
The BDS does not target individuals, as I said. So it doesn't target people because they're Israeli. If, let's say, LSE invites an Israeli academic, an anthropologist, to give a lecture, to participate in a conference, she just happens to be Israeli. She just happens to be an Israeli academic. She does not represent Israel. She doesn't represent a complicit Israeli institution, she's just affiliated to one, the boycott would not apply. So we don't target Israeli individuals. Now, if by targeting you mean if the boycott really becomes even more effective and starts hurting the economy of apartheid, it will naturally affect everyone benefiting from apartheid, as was the case in South Africa. But then we're talking about colonial privileges. We're not talking about people losing their rights. We're talking about settler colonists losing some of their privileges because their settler colonial system is losing power. And what's wrong with that?
Yeah, it certainly happened in South Africa, I think, that white South Africa began to understand that they were going to have to lose their privileges, and also that the world was looking at them in a way that they did not like. You know, what have you learned from the South African boycott that has changed the way you direct BDS?
We've learned a lot. I was personally part of the South African anti-apartheid movement when I went to school in the United States, in college. So I personally learned a lot. But as a movement, South Africa was a key inspiration for us. We have direct relations, we still do, with leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. The late Desmond Tutu was a personal friend and a mentor of sorts for me personally and for many of us. Ronnie Castrels and many others were Joe Slovo, of course. So Steve Biko, many were real inspirations for us. That's at the philosophical theory of revolution, theory of change level. But even as far as tactics are concerned, we learned a lot from South Africa. The most important lesson is that addressing the complicity of institutions, states, and corporations is key, that you cannot do it alone. Boycotts were one of the 4 pillars which ended the South African political apartheid system, but that was a very important pillar. Palestinians, it took us a while to get that international pillar the same way, because the PLO was part of the international revolutionary movement. We understood solidarity as the Cubans supporting us and the Vietnamese supporting us and the Algerians supporting us and so on, but not ending the complicity of Western states, Western corporations, or Chinese states, whatever the case may be. So ending complicity is the key lesson we learned from South Africa. But we avoided the blanket boycotts that the South Africans did. We chose targeted boycotts.
And there has been in the last period quite a lot of sort of reaction against BDS. Do you see that as the success of BDS? Do you think that the way that certain European countries are trying to legislate against it is something to do with the fact that you're gaining traction, or?
I would think so, yes, because Israel established or dedicated a full government ministry for fighting BDS, which is now defunct. They disbanded it last year because it was a total failure. Despite spending hundreds of millions of dollars over the years, it totally failed. BDS kept growing and growing. Yes, we think Israel, and in Israeli leaders' words, they call BDS a strategic threat of the first order. And sometimes they compare it with serious military threats. But why would a nonviolent human rights movement present such a serious threat, except when a regime is so based on criminality and illegality that it fears the human rights discourse can really undo this regime? And that's why Israel takes it very seriously, and because it sees the impact. Not yet economically. We're starting to see economic impact, but at the academic, cultural, sports level, and the level of the discourse. BDS unites Palestinians and unites Palestinians with every progressive movement in the world, whereas Israel is very much part of the club of authoritarian, anti-democratic, repressive regimes, from Bolsonaro to Modi to Orban to United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, you name it. They're part of that club, whereas we are part of the progressive club in the world.
Thanks, Omar. I'm sure we'll come back to you, but I'm going to move now on to Ahmed. And maybe you should talk a little bit to start with about Al-Haq and what's happened to you. And also maybe fill us in a bit about what's happening to Palestinians on the ground.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the International Justice for Palestinians for the kind invitation. It's really an honor to contribute to this panel on this important topic. Perhaps maybe I start first with the right to boycott from a legal perspective. The right to boycott has been understood as a legitimate form of expression, protected under both the Universal Jurisdiction for Human Rights and the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, both of which have been ratified and applied to the UK. But most importantly, it's also a right recognized by the UK Human Rights Act of 1998, in which it says, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. The right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and import information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers." The UK has long been a chief advocate worldwide for the protection and these rights protected by the Universal Declaration and by the ICCPR, but only when politically convenient, perhaps also only when ideologically convenient for the UK, but not when it comes to Palestine, not when it comes apparently to the right to boycott. Any restrictions on the right to boycott from a legal perspective are considered restrictions on the right to freedom of expression and must comply with a three-part test, which is that any restrictions must be prescribed by law, must be to pursue a legitimate aim, and must be necessary in a democratic society. I don't think we need to delve in discussion why any proposed BDS bill or anti-BDS law won't actually pass this three-part test. It appears rather clearly that any BDS bill in this context are aimed at combating political expression, advocating for boycotts, divestment, or sanctions against Israel. Thus, such bills aim at effectively authorize penalties designed to suppress particular political point of view. Disgracefully, in this case, such bills aimed at preventing individual and collective efforts to hold Israel's apartheid regime accountable. To answer your question, Israel lately, as you rightly pointed out, have designated 6 Palestinian organizations as terrorist organizations. Of course, it hasn't provided a shred of evidence on these designations. These designations have been condemned widely by the international community, by special rapporteurs of the United Nations, by the special rapporteur on the protection of human rights defenders, by the European Union, by 9 European states in separate statement, by several actors. But it comes to that. I think in the Israeli perspective, in the Israeli apartheid regime mindset, any form of resistance that the Palestinians will pursue is illegitimate, is not wanted. Whether it be legal action that we as a human rights organization engage in, or what the BDS movement does, or otherwise.
What is the effect on you if they designate you as terrorist? What does it do to you?
It's the effect is great. First, every and each one of my colleagues in Ramallah now under this designations can face up to 25 years in prison for their work in our organization, and the same applies to other organizations. But the main goal, I think, behind these designations is to intimidate other bodies from dealing with the Palestinian civil society, is to delegitimize Palestinian society, because Israel has been losing the public opinion, has been losing to form a narrative as it wants. Israel, as a colonial, settler colonial regime, never wants the Palestinian indigenous people to have their own narrative. But civil society in general, whether BDS or human rights organizations, in my view, is a reflection of how civilized Palestinian society is. Civil society in Palestine, in many of these organizations, are even older than Palestinian Authority itself. Some even may argue older than the national movement. And I think, in my view, civil society, as I said, is a reflection of Palestinian society, that Israel cannot break the will of the Palestinians. The colonizer mentality is that they impose all restrictions and all suppress and domination of the indigenous people, hoping to break them into submission. But this is not happening. And Palestinian civil society lately achieving great wins in the international arena. Not to, only to name a few perhaps, to focus on the apartheid narrative. A few years ago, it was such a taboo to mention the A word when it comes to Israel.
Yeah, I
But-
was going to ask about that because it's, yes.
Sure,
So, yeah.
but thanks to the work of civil society, now you see how many reports are there about apartheid. It's important to mention that Palestinian organizations have been talking about apartheid for decades. There have been writings about describing the reality that Palestinians living in as apartheid since the 60s. But of course, we needed the support of other civil society, and as disappointing the reality may be, only when international organizations and Israeli organizations mentioned it was taken seriously. And I think even when other partners around the world, whether Israeli organizations or international organizations, mentioned apartheid, they recognize that the Palestinians have been mentioning this for decades. And now there is a growing consensus among the human rights movement as a whole, including Palestinian civil society, Beit Salem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, UN Special Rapporteurs, and several other bodies recognizing that the situation in Palestine is in fact that of apartheid, and Israel is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. Now, if that's the case, a calling for boycott as a form of freedom of expression or for divestment and sanctions becomes actually a legal and moral obligation. And the fact that other countries, including the UK, threaten or attempts to have laws, anti-BDS laws, it shows how complicit these countries, effectively complicit in the crimes committed against the Palestinians. Especially, I give example, for example, of arms trade. This could invoke the individual criminal responsibility of certain British actors who do arms trade with Israel as aiders and abettors of the crimes committed in Palestine. But also, if I may maybe touch upon that, it's not only in the UK. We've been seeing these attempts in a large number of countries. I give examples maybe very, very fast. And there was a case at the European Court of Human Rights, in which also the UK is a party and has ratified the European Convention for Human Rights and also applies to the UK. The case of Baldessi and others versus France, where the European Court for Human Rights ruled that calling for boycotts of Israeli goods from the settlements is a right protected under the right of freedom of expression and cannot be considered incitement or discrimination, which is usually the excuse used by states that try to issue these laws. In the Netherlands, there was another attempt where Israeli lobby was pushing that the Netherlands adapt such a bill, and they mentioned that the Dutch government shouldn't sponsor any public events that call for BDS. Now, the government responded that basically, we don't do that officially. Dutch government doesn't sponsor any government event that supports BDS. But here's what's important in the Dutch government response, and let me quote it. It said, also it added in the letter to the parliament, that it should be further noted that statements made or meetings held by the BDS movement are protected by freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. These freedoms are enshrined, among others, in the Dutch Constitution and the European Convention on human rights.
That's really useful to know. Now I think from that, could we move to Britain? And I'm talking, Ben. Let's talk about what the UK government in this context is planning to do in regards to restricting the right to boycott.
Yeah, thank you. And let me echo the thanks to everyone at ICJP for setting up this event and for inviting me. So look, in terms of precisely what the government is planning to do here in the UK with its so-called anti-BDS law, it announced in the Queen's speech in 2019, which I think was something like 15 prime ministers ago, something like that, back in the golden age of Boris Johnson. But in that Queen's speech, the government announced that it was going to bring in a bill, and I quote, that would stop public bodies from making any boycott, divestment or sanctions decisions that aren't in line with UK government foreign or economic trade policy. So we don't yet have the text of the bill, so we don't know precisely what it's going to say, but we know that this is a bill that's going to apply to local councils that are making procurement decisions. It's going to apply to local government pension schemes. Those are the bodies who invest the pension funds of local authority workers. It's going to apply to universities in terms of how they make their investment decisions. It's worth just saying something about what this bill is not, because there have been a lot of grandiose statements and grandstanding rhetoric from some government ministers saying we are, by dint of this bill, going to make it illegal in the UK to support boycott, divestment and sanctions. And we have activists who say to us, what are we going to do when they make it impossible legally for us to continue to support boycott and divestment campaigns? So this law is not going to affect the ability of any individual to say, I'm not going to purchase goods from this particular company because it is complicit in Israel's system of oppression. It's not going to stop somebody saying, I'm not going to invest my private pension in this particular company because of its complicity, or I'm not going to put my money in a certain bank. Any attempt, as this law is going to do, to place any sort of limit on public bodies' abilities to act in accordance with international law and ethical principles are extremely dangerous, and that's why we should fight them. But it's important we do not fall into the trap of furthering the chilling effect by any exaggeration of what the potential impact of this could be. In terms of the question, why is the government doing this? There's, first of all, a very narrow mechanical reason. This is their response to a defeat, and I feel obliged to mention this because their defeat was at the hands of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. So in 2016, the Department for Communities and Local Government tried to introduce regulations that would prevent local government pension schemes from divesting from companies complicit in supporting human rights abuses, violations of international laws by states, unless the government itself had introduced sanctions against that state. And also, it was going to prevent them from divesting from the UK defence industry. We took them to court. We won in the High Court, we lost in the Court of Appeal, and then we took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and we won in the Supreme Court in 2019. We won on a very narrow ground. We won on the basis that the government did not have the power to do what it was attempting to do. So this bill is the government's response to that. It is its attempt to give itself the power by introducing primary legislation.
I'm going to ask you in a bit to talk about the kind of things that you're organising to combat this bill, but I want to bring Manveer in here to talk about the bill and what we know about it.
Sure.
And that court.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you on behalf of ICJP to all the panellists here today. They're incredibly inspiring, and it's an honour to be up here with them. In terms of the boycott, divestment and sanctions bill, just to echo what Ben was saying, it does seek to ban public bodies from engaging in boycott, divestment or sanctions campaigns against foreign countries where this might be inconsistent with UK foreign policy. In relation to UK foreign policy applying to the occupied Palestinian territory, the Foreign Office's guidance on businesses recognises that the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Gaza and the Golan Heights have been occupied by Israel since 1967. It also recognizes that settlements are illegal under international law and constitute an obstacle to peace. The guidance further goes on to say that the UK government does not encourage or offer support to any activity, so this includes financial transactions, investments, purchases, procurement, as well as any other economic activities in Israeli settlements or that benefit Israeli settlements. In relation to this, a number of councils have issued resolutions or motions confirming that they do not want to invest or engage in businesses that are complicit with illegal Israeli settlements. Now that appears to be in line with what UK foreign policy is saying on settlements, and so now there's a bit of a quandary in terms of what is the purpose of this bill. If these local councils are acting in line with local foreign policy, then why are you introducing this legislation? In terms of the narrative of the legislation, whilst a lot of references are made to Israel, if you go back to what the purpose of the bill is, it says the purpose is to stop public bodies from adopting their own approach to international relations, as this is claimed to undermine community cohesion. Now that is it's incredibly broad, and it's not specific to Israel, which means that there's potential implications for this applying to boycott campaigns in relation to fossil fuel industries or in relation to businesses that are complicit in human rights violations in other foreign jurisdictions as well.
So if we go back to you, Ben, given that, are you allying with other civil society organisations to combat this bill? Where are you putting your campaign?
Yeah, I'll talk about the work that we've been doing to build a very broad campaign, and that's on the basis that if the aim of what we're trying to do is to defeat this bill. So it's not a campaign. Sometimes we set up campaigns where we think we're not going to win this, but we will use this to galvanise people to become active or, effectively as a form of protest. We think this bill can be defeated through various mechanisms. And in order to do that, we have to build a very broad campaign that makes clear that this is a threat to the rights of all. And I'll just say something, because part of doing that, I think, is making people aware of the context of this bill. There's a context, a very clear context. This is primarily motivated by the design to suppress boycott, divestment and sanctions in relation to Israel. And what Ahmed's talked about, that global context of Israel's efforts to use allies to introduce laws to prescribe BDS in various locations. That's the context of why the government is doing what it's doing. But there's an additional context we're focusing on, which is people need to understand this in a domestic context of a government that is bringing a whole raft of repressive legislation designed to curb the right to protest, designed to curb the right to hold the government, institutions, corporations to account, the policing bill, the nationality and borders bill, the spy cops bill, and others. So we've been working very, very hard to build a large and broad coalition to oppose this bill. In April of this year, some of you will see, this was launched. If you Google right to boycott, you'll see a website that was set up. And we launched this in April with a statement signed by over 60 organisations. They include 13 trade unions that represent millions of workers. And remember, in terms of the pension angle, it is the money that belongs to union members, local authority workers, that the government is trying to say it should have control over how it's invested. It includes faith-based organisations, the Quakers, the Methodists, Muslim Association of Britain and others, climate justice organisations, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, human rights organisations, civil liberty groups, a whole raft and range of organisations. Why have they signed up? Firstly, as the statement says, all of the people who signed up, they do not need to be committed or have a policy supporting BDS specifically in relation to Palestine. They need to understand this bill as a threat to the rights of all. And first of all of them believe that it is a right of public bodies, but more than that, the way we framed it, it is a responsibility, going back to what Omar said, to break ties with companies that are contributing to violations of rights, violations of international law, wherever such acts occur. Secondly, They recognise the importance of boycotts and divestment. I think this is something that Christobel is going to refer to in the context of South Africa, as a tool with a noble history to hold rights-abusing regimes and companies to account. And it's worth noting in this context of the campaign against apartheid South Africa, the only domestic precedent for a law like this comes from the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher tried to introduce a similar law that would prevent local authorities from supporting the boycott of South Africa. And thirdly, a lot of the organisations that are signing up recognise this as a precedent. I think Sarah Lee is going to speak about this a bit. We have seen in the United States that once you pass a law that is very specifically trying to prevent boycott in relation to Israel, you set a template and a framework for other similar laws to be introduced. So once you've established the precedent that the government can say, local authorities or public bodies cannot act outside of the will of the government or in conflict with UK foreign policy, why can't you set the same law to say you cannot act outside of the context of environmental policies? If you want to divest from fossil fuels, you cannot do that unless that is a government policy. And as Sarah Lee will probably talk about, we've seen that very directly in the United States. Laws introduced specifically saying you cannot have a contract with this state if you support a divestment or boycott in relation to Israel, have been used as a template to say you also can't have a contract if you support fossil fuel divestment, you can't have a contract if you support gun laws, and now in the aftermath of the Supreme Court judgment, we're seeing states trying to introduce laws saying you cannot have a contract with this state if you are campaigning for women's abortion rights. So those are the reasons why this broad coalition of people that are coming together. This is a bill we know that is targeting and designed to suppress the rights of Palestinians, as Ahmed has said, but it is a direct threat to the rights of everybody to encourage people to take the right action to end their complicity with rights-abusing regimes.
Thanks, Ben. Can we move on, Christobel, to you, because of your experience with the boycott, sanctions and disinvestments in South Africa? Can you give us, I know it's a lot to ask you, a quick summary of what you think was effective in those campaigns?
Well, boycott, divestment and sanctions was absolutely central to what the anti-apartheid movement did. And I'd refer back to what the other speaker said about complicity, because the anti-apartheid movement it always said it will be the people of South and Southern Africa who will win their own freedom. But our job is to stop the very many ways in which Britain and the the US, the West, supports South Africa. And South Africa was crucially dependent for arms supplies, on investment, hugely on foreign investment, on bank loans, and on trade with the rest of the world. So what we were saying was, look, what we have to do is stop the ways in which we ourselves, our government, our corporations, and us as individuals, if we buy South African goods, are supporting the apartheid regime. So that was the whole point of divestment and sanctions. And we were talking before we came in about how, now things may seem difficult in relation to Palestine, but it wasn't easy, because now looking back, because apartheid was overthrown in 1994, Mandela became president, there was a democratic election, it was a success, but it took an awfully long time, and it didn't seem like that along the way, as you, Gillian, will remember. Anti-apartheid became a way of life for some of us. We never thought it was going to end, but it did. So it took from 1959 with the boycott movement until 1994, and it built and built.
Although it also took the South African people to rise up together. But this was a crucial part of actually telling white South Africa and telling the world what was going on. Or
yes.
Was it more than that?
It was more than that, because it had in 1977, the only thing that the UN Security Council, the only mandatory sanction there was against South Africa was the arms embargo in 1977. And that was terribly important, because there was armed conflict in Angola. And it meant that South Africa lost its air superiority, and it spent a lot more on weaponry than it would otherwise have had to do. And then investment, companies did withdraw in the 1980s, and this was a lot because the South African economy itself was becoming unattractive because there were economic tensions in trying to implement apartheid. But it was also, certainly in the case of Barclays Bank, there was a long campaign, as I'm sure most people here will remember, to make Barclays Bank disinvest, which it did in 1986. And that was because of the boycott campaign.
I have a very strong memory of Barclays Bank, because that was when I was a student and we were always leafleting on Barclays banks, etc. And Omar, you mentioned Barclays Bank again. I thought, oh, we've come back again.
Yes, indeed.
The thing is, Barclays was very complicit, but so were all the banks, but we just chose Barclays. Why did we do that?
That was an issue, and I wanted to make that point, that quite rather separately, the anti-apartheid movement, I think, unlike PSC in many, with many companies, never asked British people or internationally to boycott actual companies. They asked for a consumer boycott, except in the case of Barclays and Shell. And it was an issue, and we said that Barclays was the biggest high street bank in South Africa. And there were campaigns against bank loans. There was HSBC, which was then the Midland Bank, had bank loans. There was a big campaign against that, and the banks. And in America, there were campaigns.
My memory is also that the other banks ran scared when they saw what was happening to Barclays. Is that why you would pick a particular bank and was particularly complicit and go for them?
It was because Barclays was big in South Africa.
Right.
And we came up against that. It was big in the Caribbean. We came up against that when we leafleted outside Barclays Bank. You had very many British people of colour who banked with Barclays because that's what they'd done back home. It was a peculiarly international bank.
Can we just move on to Sarah Lee, because I'm thinking, we've got so many people with so much to say, but I also want to open up to the audience for questions. You were speaking here in May at the Responding to Apartheid panel, and you used the expression exportation of authoritarianism. Can you talk about what you meant by that and what we're seeing in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to understand these laws that are attempting to prohibit what people in the West, in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, in France can say, the opinions they can express, including by where they invest their money or don't invest their money. That is obviously an endemic problem in the Middle East. But is an effort of Israel to export its authoritarian rule that it has, of course, within Israel-Palestine, with severe restrictions on the speech of Palestinians. It's not just freedom of movement that's not allowed, it's free expression that's not allowed, civil society assembling, gathering, advocating is not allowed. That's why the 6 Palestinian organizations were banned. And the way in which they are fighting, they're losing a fight in the West, is to go after our speech. In Palestine, they're using bullets and bombs, but in the West, they're using lawfare. I mean, interestingly, a term that they've tried to characterize legitimate use of law, to create an environment that restricts the speech of American people. And now a form of speech, of course, is a choice to boycott the speech of British people. And the anti-boycott laws are one way of doing that, and there are over, I think, 39 anti-boycott laws passed by various US states. And you guys are going to get a stab at yours fairly soon. The American anti-boycott laws initially were explicitly to sanction individuals, even though they pretended it wasn't individuals and just institutions, that choose to boycott Israel. So there would be state sanctions against people who choose to boycott Israel or Israeli settlements or whatever. Those have happily faced challenges in courts on free speech grounds, And happily, when taken to appellate court levels, a number of these actions, efforts to sanction, have failed on free speech grounds. And so that's why there's been such a dramatic shift to using another method of silencing speech, of sanctioning speech that is critical of Israel, and that is by using the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism, pushing institutions, pushing governments to adopt that as their definition of anti-Semitism, and then pushing these institutions, businesses, universities, state associations, local city councils, to take action and, i.e., sanction individuals who are deemed to run afoul of this definition of anti-Semitism. And what's important to note is that this definition of anti-Semitism specifically includes, as an example of anti-Semitism, criticism of the State of Israel as a racist endeavor at inception. Well, surprise, surprise, that means that characterizing Israel as an apartheid state is defined as anti-Semitic speech, and therefore entitles the university or the local school board or the government or a business to take action against the individual who is expressing that speech. You know, I hope that that will eventually face the same kind of challenges in the judiciary. But the effect is also very clear. It's meant to chill speech. It's meant to scare people from opening their mouths. It's meant to intimidate us and bully us into silence, knowing that we are going to be in the crosshairs, not only for pro-apartheid extremists who go around bullying gatherings like this by filling up the roster with the names of Golda Meir and so forth, so that we don't even come and talk about this, but even more. Bringing our elected officials, using them as weapons against us. And the scary thing is, as was alluded to, is that there are now, for example, over 100 copycat laws in America that literally photocopied the anti-Israel boycott laws and replaced them with climate change, that replaced them with anti-fossil fuel boycotts, that replaced them with anti-tobacco, anti-firearms boycotts, so that you have over 100 laws now that will sanction Americans if they dare to say, I'm going to boycott the gun manufacturers, or I'm going to boycott the fossil fuel companies and so forth. So it's creating this, you know, spreading like wildfire restrictions on our most prized freedom, and that's our freedom of speech. It's like, you're going to try to take that away from us here too. Not enough what you're doing to the Palestinians, but seriously, exporting this authoritarianism to our own countries, but as Omar was most importantly noting, with the complicity of our elected officials and our corporations.
And Ben and Manvir, you're nodding like anything. Do you want to add something about this country and how that's happening as well? Not just in the courts of law, but perhaps in the universities. It's happened to the Labour parties. Do you want to talk to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, the rationale and justification for these laws, as Sarah said, and the same is applied in the UK, is the rationale of anti-Semitism, which depends, as she said, on the conflation of anti-Semitism with legitimate critique of Israel's regime of oppression and advocacy for Palestinian rights. And the IHRA definition is a tool in that. And what is used in relation to boycotts, so the narratives that accompany these laws, and we've had this in the UK, so the government, in the commentary attached to the Queen's speech, where it says, why do we need this bill, talked, as Manvir said, about boycotts cause disruption to community cohesion. Well, we know what that means. That's a way of saying boycotts are divisive, discriminatory, and are anti-Semitic. So the argument is, if you're calling for a boycott in relation to Israel because of its violation of rights and international law, then you must be either motivated directly by hatred of the Jewish people, or at best, you are likely to foment and encourage anti-Semitism. It's an absurd argument. It was one made shamefully by Keir Starmer in a speech he made to Labour Friends of Israel, where he said that the Labour Party did not support the BDS movement because it singled out Israel. And we might want to say in response to that, who should Palestinians call to be held account, if not their direct oppressor? Nobody at the moment, and the government is not suggesting that Ukrainians, in calling for sanctions against Russia and not Saudi Arabia, must be motivated by Russophobia. So it is only an argument, this argument of racist motivation, that is used specifically in relation to any attempt to hold Israel to account.
That was going to be my last question to Omar, is that how do you counter this straw man that comes up as, why are you punishing Israel when you don't punish Saudi Arabia, you don't punish this despotic regime and this one? How do you reply to that? And then we'll open it.
Well, they use this singling out Israel to chill speech in the West. They don't use it against us because it would sound totally ludicrous. What are we, the oppressed, going to fight China because Israel is occupying us? I mean, they get the logic. I mean, so they don't use it against us, luckily. I mean, Martin Luther King did not have to fight the Mexicans. He had to fight, the Jim Crow system in the United States. Oppressed fight oppressors. We boycott oppressors to end their oppression, to enjoy freedom, justice, equality in our homeland. So naturally, this is against a system of oppression, not against the identity that this system claims. That it's as if it represents all Jewish persons. Now, everyone sees, in this room at least, how this is so anti-Palestinian, how this is so racist. They're denying us our own historical narrative, that we've been expelled, ethnically cleansed. We cannot even say that Israel was established by ethnically cleansing us based on racist endeavors and so on. It's not just that, it's very anti-Jewish, this discourse. It equates Israel with all Jewish persons. It makes all Jewish persons a monolith. Everyone is the same. That's a very anti-Semitic statement. It makes every Jewish person responsible for every Israeli crime. That's anti-Semitic. And that's why there are dozens of progressive Jewish organizations that have condemned the IHRA definition, the bogus definition of anti-Semitism, as exactly that. A weaponized definition that is designed to simultaneously oppress and suppress Palestinians and their advocacy of their rights, and undermine real fights against real anti-Semitism to protect Israel from censure and accountability. That's exactly what the IHRA does. And now increasingly, even some liberal Zionist Jewish groups are coming to realize how dangerous this is, how anti-Semitic this is actually.
Thank you. I'm going to open up now to questions. Could you put up your hand if you have a question? And do we have microphones? Does anybody have a... there's the man in the white shirt and these two people here. Do you want to start? Man in white shirt over there.
I think there's a microphone back there, Gillian.
It's coming to
Oh, okay.
Thank you. It's a bit of a technical question. So if that 2019...
Could you hold your microphone up to your mouth?
If the bill proposed in 2019 passes through Parliament, would there be a way to challenge that in the Supreme Court? Or could there be a way?
Sure.
I think in terms of the bill, if it does pass, there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of how that would actually apply, especially if there's conflicting foreign policy, and so that would need to be tested and challenged in the courts. And that's something that we saw after the Pensions Act has been passed. Local authorities are finding it completely... There's a real uncertainty in how that law actually applies.
Thank you. There's a question over here.
Hello. I'd like to bring in Germany. 2019, we saw a very punitive anti-BDS legislation in Germany, and it's been Orwellian nightmare for British artists like Brian Eno, the magician, Young Fathers, the British band, Camilla Shamsi, the novelist. And I'd also like to really importantly put on the table Documenta, which is Germany's biggest art exhibition, the biggest art exhibition in the world, like the Olympics or Mecca of contemporary art. I was one of the British artists in Documenta. Every single day we got death threats, stalking, surveillance. Our exhibition was vandalized before it opened, and that was to anyone who was pro-BDS. And even though this exhibition ended on the 25th of September, we still get this daily threats, and also the Palestinians. So surely we have a lot of documentation of the horrible effect of what's happened in Germany, and surely that can help us. And also, how could we help current persecuted British artists who, such as myself, who are pro-BDS, who are under constant daily siege?
Shall we take that as two? Is the first one is, would you like to speak to what's happening in Germany? Anybody on this panel, Omar?
Yes, actually, like I'm glad the question is about Germany. At least so far, at least 7 German courts have consistently upheld the right of activists to use public facilities in BDS-related events. So there have been several cases, so far at least 7, and the number is growing, where the cities said that BDS activities cannot actually use public facilities. These decisions have been challenged, and there have been decisions where the courts convicted the several German cities, saying that they did violate the constitutional right to equality, freedom of expression and assembly. Even in addition to that, the Constitutional Court of the North Rhine-Westphalia confirmed the illegality of anti-BDS resolution can be challenged. So even the Constitutional Court asserted that. So any activity that has taken place where BDS rights were suppressed or prevented from expressing their opinions, or even use public facilities of the state, it has been challenged, and the Constitutional Court is affirming that they can be challenged. But I think this is part of the issue. The goal of these smearing campaigns is to intimidate people to self-censorship. So it was really shocking, like dealing with other partners in civil society around the world. Like, for example, I think a great organization working on this issue, supporting activists and those who support Palestinian rights, is the Palestinian, the European Center for
Legal Support Center.
Legal Support Center, and they do great work in telling people what their rights are, and they're a good partner of Al-Haq, and we work together. It was very shocking to see that some European citizens don't actually know that they have the right. They're just intimidated and apply a form of self-censorship and then say, yeah, I can't do that actually. But then you talk to them, why do you think you can? It's a constitutional right you have. And this is a very dangerous phenomenon, as you mentioned, Sarah. It's really starting to target individuals in European countries or in the US and like prevent them from exercising their constitutional rights. So the issue is not only the Palestinians, it has been for long the Palestinians, but now it's the Palestinians and anyone who dares to speak for Palestine.
Thank you. Would anybody like to add anything about it? There was a twofold question. One, what is happening in Germany, and two, how to help beleaguered artists who fall foul of what's happening.
Well, very quickly, we in the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel have been fighting Pop Kultur, the largest arts festival in Germany, government-supported festival, for several years, and we've really won our battles against that huge festival, multi-million-dollar festival, because they have a lot of money, but they depend a lot on British artists and other artists who happen to be more progressive. And many of those artists support Palestinian rights. And the German establishment cannot deal with that, so they cancel young fathers. Many artists have been cancelled in Germany because of their support of Palestinian rights, and specifically BDS. So we called for a boycott. And those big international festivals ended up becoming little German festivals with hardly any international participation, so they became a flop. And the Germans realized that. So many of the main German cultural institutions are now really regretting what the establishment has done. There's a lot of debate. But anti-Palestinian racism is prevalent in Germany. It's mainstream in Germany. Germany must be one of the most anti-Palestinian establishments on earth, beyond Israel. I mean, horrible atmosphere of repression, and that carries on to those who support Palestinian rights. So first, boycotts work, even against those huge German institutions, and the legal work. Sue them. We win. In most cases, we win. When they deny people their rights, we win.
Sarah Lee, do you want to add anything?
I mean, you know, you have to treat every action against you seriously. If there are threats, you absolutely have to report them to the police. It's very important for the police to know that it's their responsibility to protect you from the violence of, threats and intimidation, which are illegal. So I would say take those seriously and report them to the police. Report them to local civil society, civil rights organizations. They have to document it. They have to report it. But otherwise, it's I think part of any struggle against powerful entities. It's not going to be easy. Of course, they're going to push back whenever they think you're being successful. So I would also say, be resilient. It's really part of our job not to give in to those who think they can bully us.
There was a question there. Thank you for your patience.
Back in the 1960s, I was a supporter of the anti-apartheid movement and was briefly on the executive committee, and I was therefore very aware of the power of the cultural boycott, the academic boycott, and the sporting boycott in terms of transforming the political climate around the world. And a sporting boycott of Israel doesn't make a lot of sense, but the academic and cultural boycott seems to me to be significant. And I just wondered, it's harder to bring in legislation against that because it's but it's not unimaginable that they might try to target cultural and academic institutions to stop individuals and or organizations from practicing boycott. And I wondered whether the campaign might need to be ready to deal with a renewed onslaught on that area if, as is possible and likely, the legislation against local authorities, etc., is successful. Thank you.
Well, very quickly, at the individual academics and cultural workers level, there's no way to stop them. There's always been part of BDS, which is the silent boycott, as you know, Jonathan, which means that untenured professors, younger artists, especially artists of color, who cannot afford to alienate the establishment if they want a job, we ask them not to announce supporting the boycott. Just do it. Don't say, I support BDS. Just do BDS. Boycott every Israeli complicit institution, festival, conference without announcing. Say your cat was sick, you couldn't go to the conference, whatever. Just do it. Now, as far as the institutions are concerned, let's say Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, where they have a lot of joint projects with complicit Israeli institutions, no, my cat is sick, won't cut it. They need to stop their complicity. But that will take a lot more building power within those institutions. Students supported by academics, supported by workers, pushing back against administrations and telling them, you're complicit in war crimes and crimes against humanity. Apartheid is a crime against humanity. By having a joint project with Tel Aviv University that develops something that can be used as a weapon for apartheid or used against Palestinians in Gaza or occupied Jerusalem, you are part of a crime and you should stop. So that needs more of a push of building power and possibly some legal challenge as well, I think.
Ben, do you want to talk to this at all?
Yeah, no, just to say, I mean, I think I'd echo what Omar said in terms of how might you try to introduce laws to prevent individuals taking those sort of actions is very difficult. But of course, what we know, and the German example is a good one, because my understanding, the initial resolution that was passed through the German parliament to say BDS is anti-Semitic didn't have any legal power at all. But it was used then as a framework to create this chilling effect, to give encouragement to others, and make the whole issue of advocacy for Palestinian rights a toxic issue. So that's part of the danger. But the other thing I would add is, you know, whilst we put all of the energy that we need to into defending this space, this also creates opportunities, the way I always frame it, to enlarge the space. And we see this in academic environments and among student groups. We see it in the coalition we're building in relation to the right of boycott. So in terms of some of the conversations we've had with some of the organisations who are coming on board, that starts as a conversation, look what's happening over here, this affects you as well, we should bandy together to fight this. What you find then is the space opens up to have other conversations. And to give you one very specific example, Friends of the Earth, who've joined this coalition, are now having a range of conversations with us about what more they can do within their broader work to support Palestinian rights, because they understand the synergies between the work they're doing and why climate justice is also an issue of Palestinian rights because of Palestinians as part of the global south. So those sort of conversations also open up. We defend the space, but it also creates, you know, Omar's talked about building the power of building alliances where people say, actually, this is an attack on the rights of all of us. You tell us not to break, not to have this link with this institution. Why might you not go and apply that in another terrain as well, which is going to threaten other people's interests as well?
Thanks very much. I think okay, so we now have one, are you right at the back? Got your hand up, and you were waiting first. There's three people. Could you ask shortish questions, and all three of you have the questions together because we're coming to the end. Sorry to keep you waiting.
Hi, thank you for the conference. In relation to the UK government having written to every British university asking them to adopt the definition of anti-Semitism by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, can anybody comment on what the situation is on campus with regards to student solidarity?
Thanks very much. And then there was somebody right at the back over there.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question on how the rise of Iran in the Middle East has impacted the Arab world's support for Palestine.
And there's somebody here. There are several people. So there's somebody there and there's somebody here.
Can I just ask a quick question about the title? There's a colon halfway down. Can I ask how BDS will lead to preventing impunity? Obviously, we all want that to happen. Is it a direct legal consequence of BDS that Israeli soldiers who shoot Palestinian journalists are more likely to be prosecuted?
Thank you. And then there was somebody. Yeah. Oh, good, you've got one.
Just as a person who doesn't at all have any expertise on this topic, but is there somewhere a list of like anti-BDS organisations, or for an average citizen to kind of understand where they should be, for example, investing their money? Because I think for the normal citizen it's quite complicated to know who to support and who not to support. And is this list kind of updated regularly? Because I'm sure there's so many different organisations where it's quite difficult to know what their positions are and how do you kind of investigate.
Sorry, list of companies?
I mean organisations.
Organisations.
Yes.
Thank you. Would any one of you like to take any one of those questions? Sarah.
Well, I can try to address the question, if I think I understood it, regarding Iran and what has been the role of Iran in terms of shaping the Arab world's approach to Israel-Palestine. Was that the question correctly?
Basically, it's to do with how the rise of Iran has augmented the Arab world's perspective on Palestine and has almost ostracized the topic.
Right. Well, I mean, frankly, if it wasn't Iran, it would be some other boogeyman. I think that Iran as a threat in the region has been very deliberately promoted, particularly to the Gulf states, for decades, because it's a very lucrative proposition to get some of the wealthiest countries of the world to spend massive portions of their budget, of their very large budgets, on weapons from the UK and the United States and France and Germany and so forth. It has also served much more recently as the basis for an emerging alliance between, with the authoritarian axis of the Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and their little junior support players, Bahrain and Jordan, Morocco. And the U.S. government certainly has tried very hard to assemble them as an anti-Iran coalition, going so far as to offer a security umbrella from the United States, so long as they would accept Israel being part of that umbrella coalition against Israel. That was the play in July when Biden went to Saudi Arabia. It in fact flopped because a number of Arab states just refused to be part of a security umbrella that included Israel, namely Iraq and Kuwait. But otherwise, among the big players, they very much do act as a gang, this axis, and they are at least ostensibly motivated by defending against Iran, although I think the Saudis and the Emiratis are realizing that that's not very smart play, given that they actually sit across the border from Iran. But I think that is one way in which the Abraham Accords have come to develop, by emphasizing the shared interest between the UAE and Israel vis-a-vis Iran, but also vis-a-vis their authoritarian control of the region, and certainly the price for that has been paid for by the Palestinians. I can't believe the amount of anti-Palestine hate that is generated on my Twitter feed every day from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I mean, just today, for some reason, some of these Saudi trolls think I'm Palestinian. I'm like, okay, I'm not, and they will constantly send out these vulgar comments of anti-Palestinian sentiment that, it's just shocking. It's where is this coming from? How did this arise? Where is this emerging from? But it's remarkable to me to see this kind of sentiment being encouraged by the Saudi government.
Thank you. There was also a question about lists of organizations that we shouldn't invest in. I think that's what the question was. Yeah.
No, go ahead. I mean, there's various mechanisms, and I wasn't sure whether you were talking about companies, corporations, etc., that are particularly complicit. So there are a number of places where you can get that. The BNC website contains identification of complicit targets. PSC has two databases we've created that have very specific remits. So one is for students, and it identifies, if you're a student, who does your university, so you put in the name of your university, and it says who do you invest in that is complicit, and gives you a paragraph on why they're complicit, what's the level of their complicity. We have one also that is for local government pension schemes. So it identifies who does this particular local government pension scheme invest in and why are they complicit. So for those campaigning in those arenas, they can immediately identify what are the targets. And we always sort of advise when we're selecting targets, and we always work in close cooperation with the Boycott National Committee. I mean, it echoes, I think, the conversation earlier about Barclays, which is thinking strategically about what are the targets that we want people to focus on, rather than a blanket, lots of people individually choosing not to purchase from an individual company. We think it's much better strategically when people come together with very specific focuses, which are chosen on the basis of levels of complicity, also the winnability of the campaign, and whether actually the level of complicity is also going to galvanise people, because it tells a very specific story that will illustrate to people the broader story of what's happening in Palestine. But if you go on the PSC website, you'll find lots of information about complicit companies.
Christopher, you were saying something.
I just wanted to endorse that, because we, in the anti-apartheid movement, we had long conversations about selecting which companies, you know, almost everybody had subsidiaries in South Africa, all the major companies, which companies we should focus on. And I think that's where the PSC and the BDS come in, that, you know, you need to have focus campaigns that people then adopt, rather than, you know, going out and trying to boycott everyone, which is important.
If I may, also in February 2020, after long advocacy of Palestinian organizations, including Al-Haq, the UN High Commissioner has published a database and a list of all companies that are complicit.
Not all, but a list.
Of course, a list.
Beginning.
It's a good start.
Yes,
we're actually working and doing huge amount of work trying to update this list. Was extremely difficult to get the list released, and I would say it's even more difficult to update it, apparently. But the list at least is a starting point where to see examples of companies that are complicit within the Israeli colonial settlements enterprise in the occupied Palestinian territories. If I may, I would like to go back briefly to a question asked about how this could be challenged in the UK, the BDS bill. I'm not an expert in the UK, so I'm not going to claim to be, but there was a similar issue in France, where there was a presidential decree to dissolve two Palestinian solidarity groups in France. And after the presidential decree was signed, they challenged this. And actually the Council of the State ruled that this is illegal. Presidential decree, the Council of State ruled that this is actually in violation of their right to freedom of speech. And the decision also, that's very important, mentioned that it was consistent with the anonymous Baldassi judgment from the European Court of Human Rights, the one that I mentioned earlier in my speech. That also applies here. So this can also be used in the UK. So we have similar examples where at the highest level of a state that such attempts took place, but then as any democratic society would allow for such decisions to be challenged. And personally, I believe if such case would go to any court in any fair and democratic society, as Omar also mentioned, would fail. That's why the same recommendation would stand, that challenge it wherever it is, just challenge such attempts.
I'll address the question on preventing impunity, because that's very important, obviously. We understand impunity in the broader sense. After all, Israel's repression against us, its McCarthyism against anyone who supports Palestinian rights in this country and everywhere else, has one goal, which is maintaining its criminal impunity, making sure that it doesn't pay a price for its regime of settler colonialism and apartheid. That is the whole point. So we are building grassroots power in order to end this impunity by all means. Impunity at the criminal level, individual criminal level, but also impunity at the state level, institutional level, corporate level. All of this is part of Israel's impunity. Companies that are part of the apartheid system, of the settlement system, should understand that there's a price to be paid. So when we waged a campaign against Veolia, a French conglomerate, for 7 years, it lost more than $20 billion worth of contracts, and then ultimately it had to leave Israel because it was involved in a lot of criminal activity in Israel. Similarly with many other huge multinationals. That's ending impunity also. But the biggest impunity of all, of course, is the state of Israel. And because as long as it's supported by the United States, the UK, and the EU, it continues to oppress us, to kill us, to ethnically cleanse us, and so on, and that's the key. So ending impunity is not a minor issue. It is a matter of life and death for many of us. It's a matter of freedom. It's a matter of being able to live in justice and dignity or not. So it's all about building power to end impunity. and treat Israel as every other pariah criminal state is treated.
You wanted to add something?
Just very, very little at the end. I would echo that. I think impunity should be understood in the broader sense, and the first step to fight impunity is to be able to express your opinion, to be able to say that Israel is committing crimes. After all, and I'll end with this, the Palestinians are not asking more than their basic human rights. And the world needs to understand that they won't settle for less. As a matter of fact, in my view, I think the world has for long misunderstood us. We're not even asking. We're demanding those rights. We're entitled to those rights, regardless of what countries or other states might think about it, regardless of how it made them feel. These are rights guaranteed for the Palestinian people. So no other state, by supporting Palestinians to achieve their rights, will be doing us a favor or charity. Rather, the whole international community and states have a legal and a moral, and perhaps in the case of the UK, historical responsibility to help the Palestinians achieve their rights.
Thank you. We passed what my instructions said we have to end. So unless somebody is really desperate to ask a question, what I would do is, you've given what I think is a very good, rousing end to what you have. Should we go along? Does anybody want to share anything for this audience of what would, how we could join together to help the Palestinian struggle? Or so should we go along the line? You don't have to say something if you've said if you've had your fill, but if you want to.
I'm good, thank you. Leave it for other colleagues.
Just in terms of whenever I attend conferences, I always want to have some sort of action plan in mind, something that I can take away and do. So I would say write to your MPs, write to your local council, write to your councillors, reflect on what you heard today, tell them your concerns about this legislation, which is going to have a huge chilling effect. If it was passed in the period of apartheid, during the apartheid era in South Africa, then public authorities would not have been able to engage in boycotts during that period. So it's vital that public authorities are able to engage and to support people who are oppressed, like the Palestinians, particularly where the UK government fails to do so.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, I would just say, a lot of the conversation tonight has been about what we call defending the space. So dealing with the pernicious attempts through legislation and other means to chill activism and to close down the space for activism. In relation to that, if you Google right to boycott, www.righttoboycott.org, I think it is, but just Google right to boycott, you'll see the website on which, once this legislation lands, you are going to see a whole range of activities by which you can get involved, and ideally as part of any groups and organisations you belong to oppose this bill. But the other thing that we are always conscious to say, because part of the strategy here is to make us defensive. Part of the strategy, for example, in regard to the narratives of anti-Semitism, is to make us have a conversation about anti-Semitism, not a conversation about Palestinian rights. And part of it is to make Palestine a toxic issue, so that people feel this is not something I can become engaged in. So it is important that as we devote energy to defending the space, we devote as much, if not more, to continuing to enlarge the space. And the best way we do that is just continually to be active, continuing to engage in BDS campaigns and refusing to be silenced.
Thank you. I'm going to leave you till last, Omar.
Okay.
Sarah Lee?
Yeah, I guess if we're giving our little recommendations here, I would say two things. You're here because you're not choosing the easy issues. If we were organizing something about how awful Russia is in Ukraine, we'd have 100 MPs here wearing yellow and blue and so forth, and that's great. And but we're here because we're not choosing the easy issues. We're choosing the issues where we have to push hard, but we know we're right. And so thank you for coming. Keep doing the hard work, but also, and nobody's asked me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Let's put our money where our mouth is. If we can give 1% of the money to support causes that are fighting for Palestinian rights and Palestinian freedom, as 1% as the groups that are trying to silence us and crush us and deny us these basic human rights, we'd win, right? So Google, look up icjp.org right now before you forget it's ICJP, and donate some money. Donate as much as you spend on coffee from your coffee shop every week. That would be great. That would be a great start, because of course it's not just the financial. Oh, that's a lot. It matters. This is a very small organization. It's that solidarity. It's that solidarity for the people who are doing this work every day, not just once a month or once a week or once a year, but every day. That's their job. So that vote of support with that money that you sent, it matters, and we have to stick together. We really do.
I think expose and make sure everyone knows the appalling human rights abuses that go on in Gaza and the West Bank, what happens in Israeli prisons among kind of ordinary people here, and work at the grassroots to use those abuses to show people that we have to do something about it, and opposing this bill is one way of doing that.
And finally, Omar.
Yes, I think the chilling effect depends on the chiller and the chilled, right? If you refuse to be chilled, they cannot win. If you stay warm at heart and mind, they cannot chill your speech. If you insist, I'm going to speak anyway, I will not let you intimidate me, and believe me, I'm speaking from experience. So don't let them intimidate you, no matter what. We keep doing what we're doing because we're doing the right thing. We have the moral right to pursue it. The thing is about Israel is part of the ideology is what they call the Iron Wall, an old idea from Jabotinsky in the 1920s. In a nutshell, it's building in our minds as indigenous people that we can never win. So we must accommodate our colonizers and live with it. Just accept whatever bones they throw to us. Palestinians have learned how to resist this iron wall and the cement wall that we have by decolonizing our minds. But it's not just us that need this decolonizing the minds. I think also in the solidarity movements. I think everyone needs to resist this chilling effect by decolonizing this attempt to colonize us with despair. You will never win. The Palestinians are a lost cause. In fact, they are so worried because we are winning. It just doesn't appear at the state level yet. Parliaments are horrible, your government is terrible, anti-Palestinian, but at the grassroots level, 61% of the Labour Party, post-Corbyn, the Labour Party, 61% supports BDS. We're winning, they just don't see it yet.